It was one of those summer afternoons when the heat clung to the air like a thick blanket, and everything in the small lakefront community felt still, almost peaceful. Birds sang in the distance, the faint shimmer of water reflected sunlight. Through the trees and on the porch of his cabin, my grandfather sat in his usual rocking chair, sipping a cup of black coffee. To most neighbors, he looked like an ordinary old man enjoying retirement, but those who truly knew him understood there was nothing ordinary about him. He was a decorated general, a man who had served in some of the toughest battles overseas, who had carried the weight of command on his shoulders and had never once wavered under fire. To him, peace wasn't simply the absence of conflict. It was something he had earned, something he valued, and something he refused to let anyone take from him. Unfortunately, peace was something HOA Karen could not stand. She was the kind of person who thrived on control, on paperwork, on dictating rules as though she were the queen of every street and sidewalk in sight. When she found out my grandfather had bought land and built his small cabin just outside her self-declared HOA jurisdiction, she wasn't pleased. When she found out he refused to sign her contracts or hand over monthly association fees, she became enraged, and when he told her plainly in his calm, commanding voice, "Ma'am, this land is mine and I do not answer to you," she decided she would escalate. On that hot summer day, escalation came in its ugliest form. Karen stormed up the gravel driveway in her spotless SUV, slammed the door, and stomped her way toward the porch, clutching a thick folder of papers. From inside the cabin, I could hear her shrill voice before I even saw her face. "General, or—" "Not you think you're above the rules," she barked, waving the papers in her hand. "This is a private community, and everyone here abides by the HOA. You will sign this agreement, and you will pay your dues, or you will face the consequences, my C." Grandfather didn't move from his chair. He set his coffee cup down on the small table beside him, lifted his eyes slowly to meet hers, and with that same measured calm he carried in war and in life, said, "I told you once, and I'll tell you again. This is my land. I bought it. I built this cabin with my own two hands. You have no authority here." Karen's face turned red. She wasn't used to people resisting her demands. Most of the neighbors gave in to her because they were tired of the fights, tired of the endless notices, fines, and threats. But not him. And the more she realized she could not control him, the more her fury grew. She stomped closer, her voice growing louder, until she was practically on the porch yelling about rules, contracts, and fines. That's when everything shifted. Her hand went to her purse, and before anyone could fully register what was happening, she pulled out a small, black pistol. The air itself seemed to stop moving. The neighbors who had gathered at the end of the driveway gasped audibly, and even the cicadas in the trees seemed to go silent. Karen raised the weapon with trembling hands and pointed it directly at my grandfather. "You think you're tough?" she shouted, her voice shaking between anger and fear. "You think you can just ignore the HOA? You're not special, old man. You will do what I say, or you'll regret it." Time slowed. I remember the way the sun reflected off the barrel, the way the neighbors stood frozen in shock, some covering their mouths, others whispering in disbelief. No one could believe that an HOA dispute, a ridiculous argument over contracts and control, had turned into this. But my grandfather, he didn't flinch. He leaned forward in his chair, placed both hands on the arms of the rocker, and stood up with a steady grace that only decades of discipline could build. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't beg. He didn't shout. He simply looked her dead in the eyes, and for a moment, it was as though the years rolled back and the battlefield was right there before him. His presence alone, his unshakable calm, was more powerful than any weapon. "Do you know what fear looks like, Mom?" he said in a low, steady voice. "Because I don't. I've looked men in the eye who were ready to die. I've walked through fire, through bullets, through hell itself. And you, pointing that thing at me, you think that scares me?" The weight of his words settled over the crowd like thunder. Karen's hands trembled harder, her grip on the pistol shifting as her confidence faltered. She had expected him to cower, to panic, to plead. Instead, she was the one unraveling. Still, her pride wouldn't let her back down. She tightened her jaw and said, "You don't understand. I run this community. Everyone listens to me. You don't get to be the exception. My grandfather took one step forward, slow and deliberate. You don't run me, he said. And if you think waving a gun makes you powerful, then you've already lost. The crowd at the end of the driveway shifted nervously. Some whispered for someone to call the police. Others stared wide-eyed, unable to tear themselves away from the sight of a general standing toe-to-toe with an angry woman holding a firearm. I watched Karen's eyes dart from his face to the neighbors, then back to the gun in her shaking hands. She wanted control, but the more he stood tall, the more it became clear she wasn't in control of anything. You're making a mistake, he said quietly, his voice now carrying the weight of finality. One that will cost you far more than you realize. And for the first time since she stormed onto the property, Karen's mask cracked, her arm wavered, the trembling grew worse. And in that moment, though she held the weapon, she looked like the weakest person on the property. The neighbors saw it too. Some began pulling out their phones, recording the entire incident. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. This was something that could change the entire community. My grandfather stood perfectly still, hands at his sides, his eyes locked on hers. His silence was louder than her shouting had ever been. And though no bullet was fired, no punch thrown, the battle was already decided. She had exposed herself as dangerous, reckless, and unfit to lead. When the distant sound of sirens finally cut through the thick air, Karen's face went pale. She hadn't expected anyone to call the police. She hadn't expected to be caught in front of half the neighborhood. And as the wail of approaching patrol cars grew louder, the fear she had tried to impose on my grandfather now settled deep in her own chest. He hadn't moved. He hadn't needed to. He had won this battle the same way he had won so many before, by refusing to give fear a place at the table. The wail of police sirens grew louder, echoing through the trees and over the calm surface of the nearby lake. Neighbors who had been frozen in place now shifted uneasily, some stepping back, others pulling their children closer. A few whispered to each other in shock, phones still raised, recording every second. By now, nearly a dozen witnesses had seen Karen, the self-appointed ruler of the HOA, point a gun at an elderly man on his own porch. And not just any man, my grandfather, a decorated general whose very presence commanded respect. Karen's hands trembled as the gun wavered in the air. Her eyes darted left and right, as though she was only just realizing how outnumbered she was, how exposed she'd made herself. For years she had bullied neighbors with fines, with paperwork, with intimidation tactics that seemed to work, because most people were too tired to fight back. But now, in the middle of her worst stunt yet, she wasn't facing another tired neighbor. She was facing a man who had commanded soldiers in battle, who had survived artillery fire and ambushes, and who didn't know the meaning of fear. The ETA patrol cars screeched to a stop at the end of the gravel drive. Doors flew open, and two uniformed officers stepped out quickly, weapons drawn as they shouted commands. "Drop the weapon! Put the gun down now!" Karen froze like a deer in headlights. She stammered, But I'm the HOA president. He's violating—" "Drop it!" One officer barked again, his voice leaving no room for argument. Slowly, reluctantly, Karen lowered the pistol. Her hands shook violently as she placed it on the ground and stepped back. One officer rushed forward, handcuffing her as she sputtered, "Excuses. You don't understand. He won't follow the rules. He's undermining the HOA. This is my community." The officer looked at her like she had lost her mind. "Ma'am, you just pointed a loaded firearm at a resident on his own property. You're lucky this didn't end a lot worse." Meanwhile, my grandfather hadn't moved an inch. He stood with his back straight, his hands at his sides, his gaze steady. The moment the officers arrived, he simply shifted his eyes from Karen to the uniforms, then gave a respectful nod. "General," one of the officers said with recognition, lowering his weapon slightly, "we've heard about you. Are you all right, sir?" My grandfather gave the faintest of smiles. "Never better. She's the one you need to worry about." Neighbors murmured in agreement. Phones kept recording. And just like that, the power Karen had clung to for years crumbled to dust in front of her. Karen tried to fight back, even as she was being escorted to the squad car. She shouted about bylaws, about authority, about how she had the right to enforce community standards. But her words sounded hollow now, desperate. The neighbors who once gave in to her demands were shaking their heads, whispering about how far she had gone, how they had been too afraid to stand up until now. "You're all going to regret this," she shrieked as the officers placed her in the back of the car. "Without me, this neighborhood will fall apart. He's not one of us. He doesn't belong." The words echoed, but no one came to her defense. For the first time, the neighborhood wasn't afraid of her. They were embarrassed by her. One officer turned back to my grandfather. "Sir, we'll be filing charges against her. This was assault with a deadly weapon. Do you want to press additional charges?" He paused, then looked around at the faces of the neighbors, at the phones recording, at the fear and uncertainty that had hung over this community for too long. And then, in a voice steady and deliberate, he said, "I don't need vengeance. I need accountability. Do what the law requires. That's enough." The officer nodded. "Understood, sir." That night, after the police cars rolled away and the neighbors dispersed, I sat with my grandfather on the porch. The cicadas had started up again, the lake reflected the moonlight, and for a while everything was quiet. But I could tell his mind was still turning, still weighing what had happened. "You know," he said at last, "it's not about me. She didn't point that gun just at me. She pointed it at every neighbor she's ever bullied, at every person she thought she could scare into silence. Today wasn't just about standing my ground. It was about showing everyone that fear only works if you let it." I thought about that for a long moment. He was right. Karen had ruled the neighborhood with fear, with threats, with intimidation. And when she finally went too far, it wasn't his strength alone that brought her down. It was the fact that everyone saw her for what she really was. Over the next few weeks, word spread quickly. Karen was facing charges. The HOA board once, so loyal to her, scrambled to distance themselves. Some resigned outright. Others admitted they'd gone along with her out of fear. The community meetings that followed were tense at first, but little by little something remarkable began to happen. People started speaking up. Neighbors who had never dared challenge her before now raised their hands, voiced their opinions, and asked questions. They began rewriting bylaws, dismantling the unnecessary fees, and restoring freedoms to homeowners. The HOA wasn't abolished entirely, but it was transformed. No longer a weapon in Karen's hands, it became what it should have been all along, a tool for fairness, for cooperation, for maintaining shared spaces without overstepping, and through it all my grandfather never once claimed credit. He never bragged, never demanded recognition. He simply went back to his porch, his coffee, and his quiet days by the lake. But the neighbors knew. They knew it was his refusal to bow, his courage in the face of a gun, that had broken the spell. Karen had cast over them. They began stopping by more often, offering thanks, bringing food, or simply sitting on the porch to share a story. In a way, he became more than just a neighbor. He became a symbol of resilience. One evening, a younger man from down the road stopped by with his wife and kids. He shook my grandfather's hand firmly and said, "General, I don't know how. You kept so calm that day. I don't think I could have done it." My grandfather smiled faintly. "Courage isn't about not feeling fear," he said. "It's about deciding not to let fear control you. Remember that." Those words stuck with me, and I know they stuck with the neighbors too, because after that day the community wasn't just free of Karen's grip. It was stronger, closer, more united than ever. As for Karen, she didn't return. The charges against her, the videos captured by half the neighborhood, and the humiliation of being exposed had ended her reign. Whatever power she once thought she had was gone, stripped away the moment she pointed a weapon at a man who had faced down far worse. In the end, it wasn't the gun that defined that day. It wasn't even the sirens or the arrest. It was the sight of an old general, standing tall and unafraid, reminding everyone that true strength isn't found in control or intimidation. It's found in integrity, in calm, in the courage to stand your ground. And that, more than anything, was the lesson that reshaped our neighborhood forever. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to HOA Karen Stories for more unbelievable HOA battles where justice always finds its way.